So what is the problem with modern horror games? Five Nights at Freddy's. FNAF is the problem. Okay, so not really, but if you spent any amount of time on the horror game sphere of YouTube, that's probably what you've been told or thought at some point. The story goes that the Antichrist, known to us as Scott Cawthon, created Five Nights at Freddy's as a last-ditch effort to become a game dev, thus marking the rapture for indie horror games. But that's not really the case. Well, yes, it did spawn popular spin-offs, or rip-offs depending on your persuasion, such as Bendy and the Ink Machine, Poppy's Walking Simulator, Baby's First Horror Game, and Hello Cash Grab. That doesn't suddenly mean these types of games are ruined just because mascot horror is making waves with certain demographics. One quick thing I want to say that, while oftentimes I'm referring to the fan base of mascot horror as children or people who grew up on it, I don't mean to say that's the only audience that still enjoys it. When talking about topics this broad, I do need to make some generalizations, and it is a subgenre that intentionally appeals more to that demographic. But hey, if you're older and love those series, more power to you. It just further proves my point about the genre expanding its reach. But to talk about what's really going on in the horror industry, and why you seem to only see these type of games in your recommendation feeds, it's important to know why FNAF became the icon that it did. On August 8th, 2014, the gaming landscape was permanently altered with the release of Five Nights at Freddy's. And at this point, I would normally go into the deeper mechanics of the game while giving a, hopefully comedic overview of what I saw in a playthrough, but well, this is all the game has to offer. So safe to say, it's not the high-skill gameplay that won the internet's love. That came from two things: over-the-top reactions to jump scares, and overly deep dives into the maybe-existent lore. Starting with the former, FNAF videos from channels like Markiplier, PewDiePie, Jacksepticeye, and more brought massive attention to the game, and it basically acted as a sandbox for videos that was super easy to create content around, since the entire point of the game was just to get jump scared, which is another point on its own. FNAF is not scary. Okay, let me take a moment to let the Gen Alpha kids write their hate comments. So the game has one trick that it just calls at different times. Big spooky animatronic appears on screen with a loud noise, YouTuber screams for a fun reaction, boom, 10 million views awarded. This gameplay loop is fun for the first one or two times you play it, but after that it just kind of becomes annoying, but that doesn't matter since you already paid for the game, so Scott Cawthon has won. Now that all sounds pretty negative, right? So why has it caused this game to explode in popularity? Well, just because you don't get scared playing the game anymore doesn't mean you can't enjoy watching other people get scared while playing the game. Thus came the rise of YouTube videos with thumbnails like these. This mix of easy to farm reactions and simple gameplay created the perfect storm for engaging 10-minute videos that also brought heavy exposure to the game. But a lot of indie titles have had their 5 minutes of fame for similar reasons and then just fizzled out. So there has to be another reason why you couldn't escape the FNAF craze for so long. And that other reason is the lore! Five Nights at Freddy's popularized throwing random, cryptic bullshit on the screen and waiting for players to make multi-hour long story explain videos. Which brings us to everyone's favorite retired Undertale enjoyer, MatPat. Game theory is likely one of the biggest reasons FNAF's story got the attention that it did. I mean, this man single-handedly garnered... It's 2.3 million, another 2 million, and that's all going to add up to about 957 million views. I need to rethink the direction of my channel, I think. These various theory communities that pop up also create a sort of inner circle feeling from the audience. And when people feel like they know some sort of exclusive information or something that other people don't know, they're going to be more likely to dig deeper into that media. So those two main elements, plus the fact that Scott Cawthon pumped out new FNAF games faster than anyone thought possible, created the perfect storm for a YouTube takeover and massive audience of new people getting interested in horror. Which leads us to... A big reason why many people say FNAF ruined indie horror isn't just because you see it everywhere, but it's also because you see its copycats as new horror games all the time. I mentioned them briefly before, but games like Poppy's Playtime, Bendy and the Ink Machine, and Hello Neighbor very clearly pull from either the overly complex hidden lore that makes no sense to drive engagement, or this cutesy thing is actually evil or a dead child. Sometimes both. YouTube, please don't demonetize me for saying that word. These more recent games in the genre are mostly just walking simulators designed to be the most watchable for a YouTube or streaming audience. They do sometimes deviate from that and bring in interesting ideas. I actually think titles like Choo Choo Charles had something going for it. I mean, not horror, but something nonetheless. And the hate for these types of clones really peaked with Hello Neighbor, I think, a game that promised a lot, but ultimately just delivered another theory-based story that has devs spamming game theory on Twitter begging for a video, which is pretty fitting for how these games function. That's because these games don't try and draw in players with well-made trailers, engaging gameplay premises, or really much marketing. They put up a shrine to MatPat and hope that one of the different theory communities across YouTube take an interest in their, at best, dubious lore. And you know what? For a lot of these titles, it worked, like, really well. The ones that got their videos came out with a ton of money and the ability to pump out the next chapter with record turnaround time. Then that flood of YouTube-friendly content makes it seem like every new horror title is some sort of mascot horror ripoff, and the true scary games are gone forever. Rest in peace to our favorite game genre. But much like when the phone guy tells you there's really nothing to worry about on the first night, this isn't the whole truth. Yes, there are a lot of horrible FNAF clones out there looking to cash grab, but truly great and spooky games were quietly being released and taking off during that mascot horror boom. They just weren't as clickable on YouTube or streaming sites. This wave of one type of horror dominating YouTube or popular culture also isn't new. It's just the first time in a while that's been targeted toward children as the primary audience. Like I alluded to earlier, it's a pretty popular take to say, indie horror is ruined, Bendy and the Ink Machine and mascot horror made this genre terrible. Yet the funny thing is, horror in games really hasn't gone anywhere. Yes, a lot of people are upset because these popular horror titles are oversaturating the market with games geared toward children, but honestly, almost every form of media is in some way, because that's where all the money and brand loyalty comes from. But when you look just beyond that surface level, you'll find a lot of fantastic horror titles have not gone anywhere. Because you know what came out the same year as FNAF and has been garnering almost the exact same types of clones across the industry? Kojima Productions' PT. This game took the horror community by storm when it came out, because despite being just a puzzle-based walking simulator at the end of the day, its atmosphere and setup were gripping as hell. But as we all know, PT never ended up seeing a full release, so we never got to see that vision fully realized. That's where games like Madison in 2022 or Visage in 2018 came into play. Both of these titles took the basic ideas that were present in Kojima's ill-fated masterpiece and attempted to flesh them out into a full game, with great success I might add. And the list of these similar games goes on. Devotion, Layers of Fear, Revile. These are all games that take about as much inspiration from PT as Walt Disney but Spooky took from FNAF. So if you didn't like this specific branch of horror and it happened to be the one that took over conversations in popular media, you might be led to believe that PT was the problem in modern horror, which it's not. Kojima, please return to it one day. I will be eternally grateful. To prove that point a little further, let's think about a genre that's horror adjacent. The survival co-op games like Lethal Company that have been a dime a dozen recently, mostly for the exact same reasons FNAF blew up, having simple gameplay, being video and stream friendly to get mass attention, and a light horror element. Though they did have the addition of multiplayer, which instantly makes any game more replayable, depending on how dumb you and your friends can get.
That happened to me too. That's exactly what happened to me. There's shock. Don't do it, schwalk. Bro's dead. Bro's actually dead. That happened to all three of us in a row.
In fact, that genre of games has pretty much pushed mascot horror out of the limelight, outside of its biggest titles like Poppy's Playtime and FNAF. I personally don't really enjoy replaying these type of games after the first couple of matches, but they still flood my Steam and YouTube recommendations since so many people love them. Yet I can still find horror titles that match my preference with just a little bit of digging. So what does all of that tell us? The real problem with modern horror games is the community's perception of it. Yep, this is a boring answer, and I know it might sound like I'm trying to make excuses for these games, but horror as a genre is expanding and widening its tent to take in a whole new generation and new type of player. So naturally, those newer titles and ideas will be at a greater risk of alienating someone who loved the old style of horror games. Then when the ones that get popular are not really your cup of tea and they start flooding pop culture, it's easy to think that this thing you enjoy is being turned into a bad parody of itself. But it's not any different than if you go back and look at some of the original big horror hits. They all followed pretty much the same formula as each other. Silent Hill 1999. Walk around a scary town with limited supplies and a gun while avoiding combat if at all possible. Resident Evil 1996. Walk around a scary facility with limited supplies and guns plural while avoiding zombies. The original Fatal Frame. Walk around an old location with limited... You get the idea. What those older games often try to instill into the player is a lack of power. You are limited on what you can do against this monstrous or overwhelming threat, and that really is the through line for a lot of classic horror games, even up to the era of Outlast, Amnesia, and Dead Space. Throughout that long stretch of time, horror was defined by that feeling of helplessness and dread. And even though you can still find those feelings in newer entries into franchises like Fatal Frame, Project Zero, a lot of modern horror has moved away from that setup in an attempt to reinvent itself and find new stories to tell. And that big difference is what many people point to as the reason they don't like modern horror. But it's not necessarily bad, it's just different and not what we're used to. And I just want to make clear, that is not to say all of these games are good and people just don't get it. Many mascot horror clones or multiplayer factory-made survival games are objectively bad, rushed out cash grabs. But for every Poppy's Playtime, there's a PT. For every Lethal Company copycat, there's a Little Nightmares. This is a genre that is becoming so wide and diverse, it's impossible to say that this specific franchise or that one concept is ruining it. But I'm not here to tell you that the horror games industry has no problems at all. Just look at Garden of Banban. But it's really nothing that no other type of game genre doesn't face. Whether it be a reliance on cliches or tacky writing, horror can suffer from these common issues much more since its entire premise relies on you feeling fear, which next to comedy is one of the most difficult emotions to induce through a screen. But there are a lot of positives to this whole thing. These major waves in the community show that horror games are not going anywhere. They're not going to stagnate and die out. A game genre without this type of hype and innovation behind it will always go the way of the collectathon, where eventually there's such few new ideas outside of the setting that the entire genre just kind of fades to black. Though I am still very much holding out hope that we will one day see Banjo 3. Get on it, Microsoft, I'm trusting you. So I want to leave you with this. If you feel like modern horror is just not doing it for you anymore, or you really hate this boom of mascot, puzzle-based, or co-op horror, really spend some time digging for lesser-known games from around the world. I promise that you will find something that you like that's new. Thank you all for sticking with the video this long if you're still here, and consider subscribing if you enjoy videos like it. I plan to cover the history and current state of a couple other popular gaming genres, and just more gaming history videos in general, and I really hope I will see you there. Peace out.